Department of English and Director of the Humanities Center, and we're very excited to have you here for today's Faculty Fellow Talk. A few quick announcements. We have our third event of the day. We've already had one event today at 10 a.m. We have this talk at noon, and we have another event tonight at 6 p.m. at East Lubbock Art House. It's the second of two events in a series called Queering Las Fronteras, Border Corporalities in Texas, which is hosted by our visiting postdoctoral fellow this year, Dr. Cruzedo Santos Guevara. And so there will be a reading and an open mic after that at East Lubbock Art House, which is at 401 Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard. If you're looking for something amazing to do tonight, that is really the only option in town, I think. Also, Tuesday, 4 p.m., we are hosting Fulbright Scholar Dr. Maxim Miroshnichenko, who will be speaking right here in this space, giving a talk on cybernetics. So put that on your calendar if you're looking for Tuesday afternoon intellectual activity. And then Thursday at 5, our postdoctoral fellow, Dr. Santos Guevara, will be giving a talk entitled Erasures, Crossouts, Overriding Indigeneity in the Mexico-U.S. Borderlands. And again, that's right here in this space, right at this podium. So that's Thursday at 5. You can find all of these events on social media if you search for the Humanities Center at Texas Tech, and that's always a good way to keep track of everything that we have going on. A few quick thank yous. First to our two student interns this semester, Wei Chen Liu, who is videoing this talk, so it will be preserved forever, as long as the internet lasts, on YouTube afterwards. So thank you to Wei Chen, and to Denise Marquez, who is our in-house, there she is, there's Denise, who is our in-house photographer this semester, who is taking photos. So don't be alarmed if you hear the click-click of the camera behind you. And of course, always to Madison Wheeler, who is the Humanities Center's Executive Administrative Assistant, and who is responsible for all things logistics, including the food that you're eating. So thanks to Madison for that. Before I introduce our faculty fellow, Professor Hegert, I want to read the Humanities Center's Land Acknowledgement Statement. The Humanities Center at Texas Tech opens its officially sponsored events with an acknowledgement of the indigenous people on whose lands we host our talks and gatherings. The center opens its events with this gesture as part of our commitment to respecting the shared humanity of different populations across diverse cultural traditions, and to remembering with clarity the complex and violent truths of our history. With that in mind, we acknowledge the sacred grounds on which we stand, the traditional homelands of the Apache tribe of Oklahoma, the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes, the Comanche Nation, the Jicarilla Apache Nation, the Kiowa tribe of Oklahoma, and the Mescalero Apache tribe of the Mescalero Reservation. We pay respect to their elders, past and present. Please take a moment to consider the many legacies of violence, displacement, trauma, migration, and settlement that bring us together here today. Today's speaker, Aaron Hegert, is Assistant Professor of Photography here at Texas Tech. He holds a BFA from San Francisco Art Institute and an MFA from Indiana University. He was a Fulbright Scholar in 2008 in Paris and a founding member of Everything is Collective. His work has been exhibited and published widely with recent exhibitions at the Utah Museum of Contemporary Art, the Aperture Foundation in New York City, Royal Nonsuch Gallery in Oakland, California, the University Art Gallery at University of California, San Diego, the Urban Art Space at Ohio State University in Columbus, and the Center for Photography at Woodstock, to name a few. The talk that he's going to present this afternoon, Seldom Seen Visual Resources and Hidden Realities, proceeds from research he conducted last spring as a faculty fellow through the Humanities Center. At the risk of embarrassing him, I told him I might mention this, I've also heard him sing a very mean version of Sweet Song Ballroom Blitz at a local karaoke bar. Some of the people in this room were in attendance that night, I think. It was a stirring performance. And so please give a warm welcome to Professor Hegert.
All right, thanks a lot, everybody, for being here. If things go badly, we might hear that ballroom blitz one all the time. Okay, so yeah, thank you for the introduction. Thanks for being here. Nice to see a lot of familiar faces. Nice to speak in person. I was thinking about it. I think this is the first one I've done in person, like, since COVID, so I feel nervous. Got a video playing here. I'm going to let this run while I do the sort of synopsis of the project. It's not done. It's not even close to done, and I'm not playing the audio. Start that. But I've been working on it really hard and thinking about it nonstop, and I just wanted to take the opportunity to share even like an unfinished version of it. So What you're going to see is this virtual camera flying through a virtual landscape. It kind of changes between a human point of view, sort of like a first-person perspective, and then it will, fly up and take different perspectives that are a lot less, human scale anyways. At some point, the colors are going to start changing, and that also is something important to the talk. It's showing you, it's like an animated version of GIS files that shows how the Bureau of Land Management and other federal agencies divide publicly owned lands in the United States, and I'll kind of break down, maybe I can answer later, exactly what they mean. Alright, so the title of this project is Seldom Seen, and as was introduced, it was supported by a Humanities faculty fellowship last year, and even though that was at least a year ago now, it's still very much in progress. I'm going to share some small samples of the different things this project has been producing, as well as this video work. There are upcoming exhibitions, a photo book, an essay, and hopefully more talks like this in the future. I should also note that I'm not working on this alone. This is a collaborative project I'm working on as part of Everything Is Collective. Everything Is Collective is an artist group that I helped start in 2013. And we've been working together on all sorts of visual art projects since then. All the projects we do in the collective are attributed to the collective as a whole, not to the individual members. So in a lot of ways, I'm really here as a representative of that group today. I'm going to tone down the volume. Quick thanks to Gretchen Korsmo and Andrew Weathers for supplying a soundtrack, a score for this video piece or film or whatever it is. So, a synopsis and short goals for the project. Broadly, this project is about the artificial division between people and nature, humans and their environment, and why these things are thought of as separate. We come at these questions through our own area of expertise, which is photography, art, and image culture, asking what roles do art, images, and visuality play in constructing and maintaining the nature-culture divide? And how does this divide fit into the bigger picture of capitalism, or even capitalist realism? Another way to ask this question might be, how do images naturalize nature? To get at these questions, we're going to be looking at landscape and landscape representation. Specifically, American landscape art near the end period of Western expansion and contemporary land management practices here in the United States. We also want to end with a question. If art and images take part in creating this human-nature dichotomy, can they also be used to undo it? Or how can we learn to see nature differently in the future? So it's also about looking for something real in the landscape, trying to find ways of seeing past conventional representations to get a glimpse of something deeper, some less processed version of nature, and how we are a part of it. To serve this aspect of the project, we're focused mostly on public lands managed by the Bureau of Land Management. These lands have a multiple-use mandate and are therefore a better place to look for the kind of complexities and dimensionality that we're after. As a central note to pivot off of, I'm going to be talking about something called visual resource management. And from there, we'll go back to look at some art, images, and ways of seeing nature that emerged in the late 19th century, thinking about how technology and photography were a factor in these changes in seeing and thinking. We'll also look at present and future ways of understanding the landscape and how technology is again changing the way we look and what we see. So back to our pivotal node, visual resource management. Visual resource management is, in the words of the Bureau of Land Management, a system used in a variety of federal agencies to help identify visual or scenic values in the landscape. The goal of visual resource management is the provision of systematic and objective information concerning the visual quality of landscapes and the visual impacts of land use activities pertinent to decision makers charged with land resource management. These land use impacts include extractive things like mining and oil or other mineral or energy development, as well as a lot of banal things like communication sites, rights of way, recreation, and all sorts of other things that come along with suburban and industrial sprawl in the West. One BLM handbook describes visual resource management as a language for looking, which is a really interesting way to think about it. And I'm going to be arguing that there's more than just one language for looking at play when it comes to the images and the realities of natural landscapes in the United States. In order to contextualize this project a little bit and to explain where I fit into this equation as an artist and a photographer, I have a few terms that I want to introduce. One of them is image complex. As described by T.J. Demos, the image complex is the whole network of financial, institutional, discursive, and technological infrastructures and practices involved in the production, circulation, and reception of visual cultural materials. That formation calls for diagnostics not centered solely on the politics of aesthetics of the image, but also on the wider channels of image circulation, the institutions of containment, and the legal, political, economic assemblages that frame and in part determine the visual culture of. You could fill in the blank at this part, but in this case we're talking about the visual culture of environmentalism. I really like the idea of an image complex because in my work I'm only kind of a photographer. Really, I work in, around, and through photography, but I'm much more interested in questions about how meaning and aesthetics are generated and naturalized in culture than I am in things like individual artistic vision or self-expression. So this term, image complex, describes the field nicely, but in order to synthesize it all, we need methodology too. And while this is definitely some kind of critical theory we're doing, it's also art. To a certain degree, I am trying to point out the ways that surface-level narratives conceal psychic or political conditions that underlie them. But I'm not necessarily going to be able to show that they fit together seamlessly or in a dogmatic fashion. So it might be better described as uncanny criticism. I've already been paraphrasing Eric Davis a little bit in describing this, and I'm going to do it more directly now. For the uncanny critic, the goal is not to reveal an underlying cause, but to gesture towards an absent totality. And I'll begin this search for absent totalities with more details on visual resource management. I'm also going to hit pause on the video, and maybe if there's question and answer, we'll start that up, and I have slides to illustrate the rest of this thing. So, visual resource management. Visual resource management is a byproduct of the National Environmental Policy Act of 1969, which, among many other things, seeks to provide aesthetically pleasing surroundings for all Americans. The Bureau of Land Management's VRM handbook says, the system is an analytical process that identifies, sets, and meets objectives for maintaining scenic values and visual quality. The system is based on research that has produced ways of assessing aesthetic qualities of the landscape in objective terms. What had been considered extremely subjective aesthetic judgment, particularly concerning the landscape, was found to have identifiable, consistent qualities that can be described and measured. Whatever the terrain, and whoever the observer, perception of visual quality in a landscape seems to be based on several common principles. Landscape character, and I'm still putting the BLM here, landscape character is primarily determined by the four basic visual elements of form, line, color, and texture. Although all four elements are present in every landscape, they exert varying degrees of influence. The stronger the influence exerted by these elements, the more interesting the landscape. The more visual variety in a landscape, the more aesthetically pleasing the landscape is. Variety without harmony, however, is unattractive, particularly in terms of alterations, cultural modifications that are made without care. So one of the first things that caught my attention with this stuff, in a sort of humorous way, was how similar the language is to what students use to critique photographs in my Introduction to Photography courses. Form, line, color, texture, harmony. The way the federal government is deciding which landscapes are beautiful enough to warrant preservation because of their beauty is a lot like deciding what landscapes would make a good picture. Performing a visual resource inventory of a region requires producing hundreds of panoramic images like these, visual simulations like this, and lots of maps. But before you can turn something into an image, a photograph, a painting, or even a map, you have to decide where to look at it from. You have to choose where to stand, set your frame, and create a composition. In visual resource management, this is called finding your key observation points, or KOPs. Key observation points are essentially the places where a landscape is most likely to be seen from. main roads, pull-offs, scenic overlooks, and popular trails. KOPs are important because if you know where someone is looking from, you can manage the landscape to appear in a certain way from that point. In places like national parks, this process is probably a little bit more straightforward. Where it gets tricky and more interesting is on the multiple-use landscapes I described before. These areas have to be available to the public for recreation like camping or bird watching, and they have to be available to industry for energy development, mining, oil extraction, and the like. Under the BLM's mandate, it all has to coexist somehow. Returning to framing and key observation points then, if in visual art your task is to frame a landscape for a viewer, in visual management, the task is to frame a viewer for a landscape. Regardless of what direction we want to imagine that framing moving in, the purpose of the frame is to impose form and structure onto nature. And the desire to impose form onto nature has a long history in Western tradition. This is a cloud glass, or black mirror. A cloud glass is a small, slightly convex mirror with its surface tinted a dark color. These were a popular accessory for European tourists throughout the 18th and into the 19th century. The idea was that a tourist, upon arrival at a beautiful and picturesque landscape, would, once they had identified the landscape they wanted to appreciate, pull out their cloud glass, turn their back on that landscape, and instead of viewing it directly, look at it in the contained frame of the black mirror. The Claude glass is named for the 17th century painter Claude Lorraine. They were named after him because they reflected the world in a way that made it look like a Claude Lorraine painting, with compressed spatial relationships and rich colors. They make a good example of this image complex feedback loop effect that we're talking about. Here's a picture of somebody taking a phone picture of a Claude glass reflecting the landscape. It gets deeper. We expect our art to reflect life, but then in turn we also start to expect our life to reflect art. We make images of things in the way we want to see them, and then in turn we want the things themselves to become those images. The problems this approach presents to our understanding of nature and the environment has been noted by ecologists, environmental philosophers, and even literary critics. As far back as 1959, Marjorie Hope Nicholson, in her book Mountain Gloom and Mountain Glory, says, "We assume that our feelings are the perennial ones of human beings. We do not ask whether they are sincere, or to what extent they have been derived from the poetry and novels we have read, landscape art we have seen, ways of thinking we have inherited. Like men of every age, we see in nature what we have been taught to look for, we feel what we have been prepared to feel." On the subject of framing and environmentalism, environmental philosopher Alan Carlson says, "The presence or absence of a frame has significance for formal qualities. Framing may allow the environment to be seen as having a certain indeterminate formal quality, which puts the accent on perceiving and appreciating the natural environment as if it were a landscape painting. That is, as a certain kind of prospect seen from a specific standpoint. This mode requires the appreciation of the environment not as what it is and with the qualities that it has, but as something which it is not and with qualities it does not have." And more recently, ecologist Aaron M. Ellison has said that even though art in the postmodern era has largely moved on from these realistic yet idealized portrayals of nature to a more nuanced understanding of underlying natural processes, ecology, ecologists, and environmentalists remain locked in the suffocating embrace of Romantic-era landscape and continue to resist this shift. He then goes even further, saying, "In short, I assert that ecology has for nearly 150 years been suffocated by a romantic notion of landscape and an artistic portrayal of nature in balance. We ecologists may in fact be studying the wrong nature." In my own opinion, this idea that artistic portrayals of landscape and romantic notions about nature stifle our ability to conceive of a more nuanced and complex understanding of the natural world is somewhere close to the truth. But I disagree that the portrayal of nature these artists were creating was romantic. 150 years ago, landscape art and science were going through big changes and developing into something they had never been before, and they were doing it together. A good example here are the artists who worked alongside scientists and cartographers on the last big suite of geographical and geological surveys of the American West. The work these artists and scientists were doing was synthesizing in weird ways. In addition to representing personal experiences of place, a job art is usually thought to do, or producing empirical knowledge about the natural world, a job science is usually thought to do, these teams were mixing all these priorities together to also do the work of Western expansion and colonization. So they were equally invested in representing an imagined community, that of the nation. Like the mixed-use priorities on BLM land I talked about earlier, these artworks also balance the priorities of aesthetic beauty, economic potential, and national identity. Similarly, in contemporary visual resource management, there is an emphasis on forming an interdisciplinary team in order to avoid weighting the outcome of the visual inventory process towards the dispositions or aesthetics of any one discipline. But that would assume that different disciplinary practitioners, artists, ecologists, landscape architects, would bring different aesthetic concerns. And also seems to assume that those aesthetic concerns would have developed out of independent and isolated histories of looking, which is not necessarily the case. Here's a photo of the Yosemite Valley that was posted to the Bureau of the Interior's Instagram page in January of 2022. The image may look familiar. There are thousands like it on the internet. It's probably the most recognizable view of Yosemite, and it is likewise probably one of the most recognizable landscapes in the world. Here's a painting Albert Bierstadt made of that same view in 1875. Around this time, Bierstadt was considered one of the most popular and important artists in the country, and his paintings could be found not just in museums or in the homes of the wealthy, but also decorating the walls of the US Capitol building. They were an important symbol of nationalism at the time. And this is the photograph that inspired both of those previous images, as well as many more. This picture is called Yosemite Valley from the Mariposa Trail, and it was taken by Carlton Watkins in 1865 or 66. When Watkins made these pictures, he was working for the California Geological Survey, and as art historian Tyler Green has written, he had come to Yosemite to make new pictures for the CGS and for his own gallery sale. The 1865-66 pictures seem to have been informed by Watkins' continuing study of American, possibly European painting, and his engagement with scientists. Green continues, now referring to photographs Watkins made of glaciers as a member of the King Survey in 1870. In several of the pictures, Watkins, who at this point in his career understood a range of science well enough to know how to make pictures that communicated it, uses shadow to suggest movement. These aren't just pictures that inform science, they are contributions to it. By the time Watkins came off Shasta in 1870, he was already the artist who had contributed the most to American scientists' understanding of the West. He was probably also the artist who had contributed the most to science, period. So to return to the quote from ecologist Aaron M. Ellison from a few minutes ago, that ecology has for nearly 150 years been suffocated by a romantic notion of landscape, which has led ecologists to study the wrong nature. We can see in Watkins' pictures the influences art and science had on each other at the time. Landscape art, photography, and scientific disciplines like ecology, geology, or glaciology are all ways of describing reality or even constructing it, that emerged and developed together. And the uncanny connections these disciplines form between themselves continue to shape the background reality or realism that defines popular conceptions of nature today. Theories about a self-organizing nature, characterized by balance and harmony, were being turned into facts, and the realm of nature was being presented as a world apart from the human one. And these were not the only new realisms about nature that images like these were naturalizing. Another reality being forged by landscape art was one where the West was an uninhabited wilderness, an image that presents nature as a place unto itself. To again quote Green, artists like Watkins were breaking the Claudian formula where landscape is used as a stage set for human activity, usually by placing people in the foreground. In a Watkins picture, as in the West, the land had always been enough. When human activity does appear, it is minimized in favor of natural beauty. Look at the picture Watkins made for mine owners. The mining operations are often only a small element. The real metaphor for the economic potential of the landscapes is their beauty. Taken together, the formalism that made nature look like art, and the art that made science look like fact, in addition to the apparent emptiness of the American wilderness pictured by Watkins and his contemporaries, added up to a national landscape that signaled capital through beauty and availability through emptiness. This version of the national landscape made implicit the justification for capitalist and colonialist uses of the land and the attempted erasure of the local people. Many aspects of the national identity still depend on this image. A Bureau of Land Management document titled Visual Resource Management, an overview, opens with an anecdote. It's going to be hard for me not to do a voice at this part. It's been said that in America there is more space where nobody is than where anybody is. That's what makes America what it is. Perhaps there is no place that statement is more true than in the great open space of the western United States and Alaska. We, of course, still think of this as America's own land of opportunity, adventure, intrigue, mystique, and enchantment. This statement pretty well summarizes what Watkins, Bierstadt, and other landscape artists were working to establish in the image of the West, and it likewise summarizes the image of the American landscape that visual resource management seeks to maintain. A landscape that is vast and wild enough to contain the adventure, mystique, and enchantment of the popular imagination, and one rich enough to provide the opportunity for limitless economic growth. Whether visual resource management is a direct remnant of these early federal engagements with landscape art is hard to say. But the similarities to how they produce and leverage a certain version of nature are unmistakable. A great deal of this leverage comes from the fact that these public-facing images privilege the human perspective, the way an individual sees the world and where they see it from, as the most important perspectives, while corporations and governments privately prioritize technological and non-human points of view that let them see and understand things in a way the individual looker cannot. Here are some pictures that show you what you expect to see in a landscape. These are taken straight out of visual resource inventories from the Bureau of Land Management. They're more colorful and perhaps a little flatter than the 19th century landscape pictures we were looking at before, but they're not all that different. These are the kind of views VRM is all about. Here's a set of visual simulations, basically Photoshop pictures. They're made up to show what a development project would look like in a landscape to help developers better minimize its appearance. Here's another way of seeing a landscape. But actually it's supposed to go like this, because it's not really the surface of the land, it's geophone data of what's underneath the surface. Here's another technological landscape view. This one is LiDAR being used to speed up the geological survey process at a platinum and palladium mine in Montana. Here's a map, or a satellite view, a way of seeing the landscape that we're all increasingly familiar with. Here's another map of that exact same territory. This one is a visual resource inventory. Here is a visual resource management map, which is similar but takes more factors into account. This is a map of distance zones, again of that same area. It is another key factor in visual resources. The dark blue is the foreground, middle ground zone where things can be seen from key observation points between 0 and 5 miles in. The medium blue is the background zone, where the landscape is visible from 5 to 15 miles, and the light blue is the seldom seen zone. These areas are hidden from view. This first one is from an older inventory. You can see that the delineations between zones were established through field work and drawing on the map by hand. Here's a distance zone map from a much more recent survey. You can see how much more detailed and specific the breakdown into zones is. This one was made using GIS software and running a viewshed analysis, and it points to the increasing sophistication that new technology will bring to managing people's perception of natural landscapes. So it's easy to imagine how these last couple maps become relevant for managing a visual experience. If you can't see something, does it really matter what it looks like? This is where the speculative part of the project comes in. We really only want to know how this stuff works so that we can use it wrong. If what we are looking for is new ways to understand nature and new ways to see the landscape, then looking at the VRM system as a way to avoid conventional ways of looking is a good start. We're not trying to make more images of a harmoniously colonized landscape. We are not trying to see what we've seen before. What we want to see is something weird, something real. What we want to see is something that is seldom seen. And the VRM system produces maps that guide you to just that. Without taking the time to explain each image here, I'm just going to scroll through some of the pages of the photo book that we're working on right now. This goes along with the video work that I showed at the beginning, and it contains a mix of things we took out of BLM handbooks, as well as original images we made based on a sort of misuse of this information. As we look at these last images, I want to reinforce our intent, which is to consider the politics of aesthetics of the image, and also the wider channels of circulation, institutional containment, and the legal, political, economic assemblages that determine how images exist in the world and sometimes change it. It's not really about visual resource management. If we don't manage the way things look, everything will eventually look the same. And it can be hard to care about or advocate for places that have no identity of their own. At the same time, the place that American landscape art invented and the place that visual resource management protects never really existed in the first place. The image of pristine and uninhabited land was always a fiction. All of North America was inhabited before colonization. The way those lands and ecologies looked and functioned was at least in part a product of human activity. So to continue to prioritize an image of the natural landscape that perpetuates these myths only serves to reinforce something similar to what Mark Fisher termed capitalist realism, or the idea that not only are things working the way they're supposed to, but that there is no reality, there is no alternative to this reality. It can be hard to get interested in the boring and bureaucratic technicalities that make the day-to-day of capitalism work. But in many ways it is here that we can see the interface of the multiple symbolic structures that create the illusions this system depends on, and the absent totalities they conceal. A few more slides than I thought I had. That's it, thank you. Happy to take questions. Is anybody going to ask about the slides? I could leave those up if we're going to go back, or I'll start that video up again for the background. Build the video over now. I'm going to switch back and forth. Does anybody have any questions?
I got a question.
Yeah.
So I was going to ask you about how to speak back to the visual history that you summarized for us, right, and all of the illusions and the ideological weight of that visual history, and then you showed us in the slides at the end how the conversation between those two sets of images. One thing I noticed, though, that's continuous between like the visual history that you summarized and the images at the end of your presentation was the minimizing of the appearance of people in the images. And I was wondering if you could comment on that, given that there's such a, an emphasis on like the humanness of the latter set of images, but why so few people represented?
Why so few actual humans represented?
Yeah,
that's a good question. I don't think that at this point that's really like a thought out part of the approach. There's still a lot of work to be done in this project before it reaches this like sort of apex exhibition that we're working on, and maybe that's something that needs to be taken into consideration. I hate to give like excuses and question and answer sessions like this, but I've never taken pictures of people. It's never been part of like my repertoire of things that I point the camera at. But I mean, maybe it's about time. There's lots of evidence of human activity. There's lots and lots of land use, roads. In the video, of course, all of these overlays blinking back and forth are evidence of human presence. But as far as the actual pictures, like maybe you get a hand here and there and things like that. I don't know. Something more instinctive is happening there. So
right. Yeah. Great. Thank you.
I'm interested in the continuities and discontinuities between the 19th century imaging of landscapes and what you're looking at now. And I think the continuities are very clear. I'm also thinking about 19th century ideas of nature and the formal and aesthetic principles of nature being understood by and large in the 19th century as evidence of God, so that there's this transcendental perspective that arranged everything harmoniously and elegantly, right? And so the contemplation of the formal principles of a landscape would, I'm talking about, white Europeans and Americans, right? Would have probably been understood at that time as that there's someone up here who is like directing everything, right? So then when we have those aesthetics being revisited in the 21st century, maybe that wouldn't be the dominant idea of the formal and aesthetic principles as being evidence of a transcendental creator. But what happens to that transcendental aspect? Did it just fall away? Are humans elevated to a kind of transcendental and non-immanent perspective, or like what happened? What happened to God, Aaron?
I'm not sure what God thinks of the Bureau of Land. It's a worthwhile discussion, and certainly maybe like a future chapter in this project. I do like, if anything, I can say that it's like one of the things that made us notice this is that in the 19th century art that I'm showing, it is like a really extreme experience, that these artists and people are having going out into the West. It is weird. They feel like they're seeing something perhaps transcendental, not just maybe like because of their belief in God and the mixture of spirituality and nationalism at the time, but just because of like the sheer intensity of what they would have been experiencing. Now we're trying to maintain that, but it's not really like, it's not weird on the surface anymore. It's not intense on the surface. It's bureaucracy, it's procedure, it's paperwork. It still has the same sort of drive, but I also don't think it's as important to anybody's vision of the national identity, right? Like after the 19th century, you see art and really just like American identity moving off more into ideas of like acquisition and personal ownership, more of things like homes and products and things like that. So this like national identity, it reemerges when it's necessary, but it's not always, it's not as big as it was. During Western expansion, it was absolutely necessary to justify everything that was going on and get everybody on board. Now we only need it when somebody tries to change the boundaries of a national monument to drill for oil or something like that, right? Or there are a lot of times that it would come in. But yeah, I don't know if it's a good idea for a chapter in the future. Thank you.
Well, of course, God and capitalism are all, especially now.
Everybody's dying.
my apologies if I kind of missed this, but this is a very practical question. Other than your collective, who's accessing the resources of the visual resources from the BLM? Is it industry primarily, and has that changed?
Yeah,
and
the Bureau itself,
accessing it different
industry.
now than before?
Sorry, I missed the last part.
Oh, just like, has that changed? Like, who's using the data?
I don't think so. The system is only, the Environmental Policy Act is 1969. BRM actually goes into effect in like 73, something like that. It's not very old. And it's really like, I'm glad there are no landscape architects in the room in a certain way, because when you talk to people who know about this and use it, they kind of like, well, why would you ever be interested in that? It's so boring, it's so obvious what it does, like there's nothing there. And that could be true. I'm applying a lot to it, But anyways, if you are to search for visual resource management on like eplanning.gov or something like that, you'll mostly come up with lawsuits, which is people who want to do oil derricks here, but visual resource management says, no, that's beautiful and it's visible. How about here, where it's beautiful and invisible? And they say, no, there's no oil there, etc., right? Or it's much more boring things. It's like, we want a road here, I want a power box here. But a lot of it is extractive stuff, or mining, or timber, or whatever. So yeah, it's the Bureau of Land Management deciding where should we put a road. If we need a road somewhere, we should consult this. And if it's a class 3, if it's a low class visual place, just make it straight. Just plow a line straight through the landscape. Who cares? Nobody's looking. If it's beautiful, spend a little bit more money, curve it around the hills, make it invisible, get it into the contours of the landscape. And then again, yeah, if you have an extractive project, a management project, development project, those would all need to be consulted against VRM. And VRM is like also just a tiny slice of what, or resource management plan is made up of. We could easily have another artist or expert next to me, and then like 7 more down the line who know about endangered species, who know about oil lease, who know about, oh god, there's so many layers. If I pull up the GIS map right now and turn on all of the layers, it's a very nice abstract painting, but Janice.
So are any of those layers containing sacred sites of indigenous
There are,
peoples?
yep, cultural
And so
modifications would be on there.
do they get consulted on where
They
these
do.
things go? That's
Yeah, that's actually like it's in visual resource management, and it's also a thing of its own.
Yeah.
So those kind of dovetail in visual resource management. It's cultural modification, which has a gamut that runs from bad cultural modification, which again is recent and ugly management projects, like the Daneros uranium mine, South Portal. Or good ones, like just across this, I can't remember where we're at. We flew past it a second ago. There are indigenous cliff dwellings on the other side of this mesa. Those are very much in an area that needs to be conserved. And if you were to look at the map and know what you're looking at from above, you'll also see some kind of like fortuitous drawings of these lines where the uranium happens to be in a non-visually distinct area, and the cliff dwellings are in a visually distinct one. Visually distinct and valuable would be red, yellow is medium, and light yellow is class 3. So, I mean, I don't have any confirmation of that, but you find a lot of like, yeah, sort of like, we're lucky that this land ended up not being very visually valuable because it's got a lot of good stuff under it. Anybody else? Other opinion?
So it seems like the point of view is assumed to be a pedestrian point of view of a human height looking out. But you know, to what are they taking into account a drone's eye view? Because also in your video is not a pedestrian perspective, right? It's a techno eye of a drone, which is increasingly how landscape photographs are created. Are they taking into account that higher perspective at all, or?
I mean, I don't know. I talk to people in the BLM periodically. If I pass an office, I usually stop by and say, who knows something about visual resource management? And usually say, go away. But they've talked to me a couple of times. And the real answer to those, I don't know, but they should be, because if you're concerned with it, as you can see from this video, I can see everything, everywhere, anytime, everybody can. This was designed and implemented and has remained largely unchanged since 1969, but as you start to go through the newer inventories as they happen, because you don't re-inventory an area until there's a reason to do it. So some of the inventories are really old. Anyways, in like the newer one that I have access to, they're not that easy to find, is Grand Staircase Escalante when it was changing into a national monument. That was re-inventoried. And that one is where you'll see like the map of distance zones that's done with GIS, so it's like that real tangle of detailed visibility zones. And in that one you will also find their use of like social media data to figure out where people stop to look, what pictures do they take, things like that. How are they going to stop people from looking from space? I don't know. In a way it's a good thing, you know. Like I think that part of this new way of looking at the landscape and understanding nature means understanding it as this hybrid, real life, digital, online, networked version. And in some ways that's depressing, but in some ways it lets us see things in a new way.
Thanks.
Anybody else?
Are there any connections between this kind of data and Google or what Google Earth is doing?
Google Earth?
Yeah.
Yeah, this is Google Earth, which I erased the watermark. Yeah, this is Google Earth Studio. It's like it takes the information from Google Earth and just turns it into a navigatable 3D space of the entire planet and the moon and Mars. Yeah, it's weird.
Why did you take the water?
I don't know, they didn't pay me to advertise. No free rides here. Anybody else?
I have a question mostly about the work that the collective produces. I mean, there's something so like visually compelling about everything that comes out of your collective, even just everything that I'm watching on the screen. So I think of these landscapes from the 19th century, all the paintings you've shared, and they're just so conventional to me that I don't even think of them as like aesthetically pleasing anymore, but I actually find your work to be very much that. And so I'm interested in like, what are you looking for as you start interjecting and kind of like pushing against within like the new visuals that you're making? Like what what are you looking for there?
Yeah, I don't know. It's a process of discovery, but I think that there is like a contradiction contained in our work just by saying this, you know, like it's a good argument that I like to make, but the work we're making works with the conventions of right now. You know, we're influenced by everything we see. Our conventions are coming from this. You see, like when we pass through the grid and everything kind of like crystallizes or turns into, you know, well, something more segmented and obviously digital. So yeah, we're in no way totally original. In fact, almost all of our work is appropriated images that somebody else made. Again, like working within this image complex. And so we're really more like, we're at this stage of processing these images and trying to make sort of like forward-looking critique out of them. In conversations with the collective, we always say, okay, after this one, then something brand new. Then we're going to be original authors and we're going to think of a new way of looking. But I don't think that that's really a realistic goal. It's just something to say.
I guess I was just trying to think about, is there like an element of chance? Is like things land within the picture frame, or like what are the engines? Like how is the image constructed? Because there was so much of these like pictorial tropes that were utilized within the 19th century. Like, is that infiltrating in some way, or like what's the?
You know, it probably is. There's no way to know what gets in and what doesn't get in. One of the ideas a lot of times is if I'm making these landscape works, like in this one, I want there to be these moments where you feel like you're looking at a 19th century landscape with just so Claudian composition, you know? And then I want it to fall apart and turn into something like more contemporary and different. So in this one, there is some sort of formula. And then like in the still images in the books that we make, that a lot of times ends up being, we have a terrible time editing ourselves and taking it down. So that turns into nearly like a chance operation. We take, you know, the 5,000 images we've generated all into one big bucket and shake it up, see what comes out, edit that down to 1,000 pages. That's where we're at now, 1,000 pages for the book. By the time it goes to publishing, it needs to be like 400 to be able to afford it.
Thank you, Aaron. This was great. Appreciate it.
All right, thanks everybody.
Ooh.
All right.